Hello and welcome everybody to NATO versus Peace. We're going to play a short promo video before getting started.
People's Dispatch.
¿Qué disparan?
El despacho del pueblo, o sea, la traducción no es
People Dispatch,
tan bueno.
Maduro Dispatch.
Así, perfecto.
Happy 3-year anniversary, People's Dispatch. You know, People's Dispatch is such a vital outlet. One of the only ones out there offering hard-hitting news, analysis, and showing us the reality on the ground.
Roger Waters, thank you so much for being with us at People's Dispatch.
Please have me back again soon.
Anytime.
People's Dispatch is really important part of my life, trust me.
Mostrando y contando la verdad de los pueblos del sur global y del mundo entero. Gracias por estar siempre ahí, por ser una ventana para las verdades y las cosas que los pueblos necesitamos comunicar.
Tem gente que luta e resiste, que te inspira e encoraja. Gente que te informa de outra forma. E, se tem dúvidas, tem quem explica o que está acontecendo na Venezuela e no mundo. In English,
the right to live is a basic right.
Ou em espanhol.
Emancipação das mulheres.
Aqui tem gente. Veja nossos vídeos em primeira mão. Inscreva-se em nosso canal. Brasil de Fato, uma visão popular do Brasil e do mundo.
Hello, my name is Kwesi Pratt Jr. and I'll be the regular host of Talk Time with Kwesi Pratt on Pan-African Television, the station that will be bringing you the best in news, in current affairs, in sports and entertainment, the station that will be making a difference. Talk Time with Kwesi Pratt will be talking to everybody in the marketplaces, in our lorry parks, in our schools, in our clinics and hospitals, in business circles and in political circles. This is the program that brings you the authentic views of the people of Ghana and Africa. And it is Talk Time with Kwesi Pratt.
The U.S. and the world are inflicted by poverty, racism, inequality, and war. But if you turn on mainstream media today, you barely know it. We're inundated daily with images of the lifestyles of the rich and famous, an analysis of the news from the perspective of big corporations and warmongers. We see everything but what you really want to know. It's not that the stories are hard to find either, it's just easy for them to ignore. But in every corner of the globe, from small towns to large cities, we know people aren't just hurting, they're also resisting. Movements are growing against inequality and empire. Socialism is gaining in popularity. New voices are finally breaking through decades of suppression and censorship. Their stories need to be told, and their perspectives need to be shared. Because we aren't just critiquing the corporate media, we're breaking through it with our own media featuring the stories that matter to you. That's why we started Breakthrough, a new media platform that goes beyond the status quo. While other networks are just talking at you, we're amplifying our movement. Don't just watch us, join us on Breakthrough.
Hello and welcome everybody to NATO versus Peace, a short course on US imperialism and the war in Ukraine. This course is going to be, this session today is going to be broadcast live via YouTube in a variety of languages. The language that we're going to be speaking here from the front are going to be English and Spanish. If you are in the Zoom, please go ahead and select your interpretation channel in the globe icon below. There are also instructions on how to get into the interpretation rooms in the chat, so please look at that. What we just played were a series of short promo videos for a variety of media outlets that we highly recommend that all of you follow. These are People's Dispatch, Breakthrough News, Pan-Africa TV, Brasil de Fato, and we will be talking about a few other media projects at another time. But if you haven't followed them already, whether it is on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, we highly recommend that you go ahead and follow them. They are a great source for reliable news on struggles around the world, and that get us to really understand what is happening in this very complex times. And that is also our goal today with the course that we are launching. My name is Stephanie, and I'm part of the International People's Assembly. And I wanted to, before we get completely into introductions, I wanted to do a quick tech orientation for how things are going to work out through this session. Like I said, there's going to be interpretation, which can be accessed through the globe icon. Also, to avoid any accidental disruptions during the session, everybody who is in the Zoom room is going to be muted, but that doesn't mean that you can't interact. We highly encourage you to post questions and comments through the chat, post them in your language, and we will find a way at the second part of the session to ask as many questions as possible to the two presenters that we are happy to have with us today. And I think with that, we can get started. So once again, the name of this course is NATO versus Peace, a short course on US imperialism and the war in Ukraine. This is a course that is being organized by the International People's Assembly, or the IPA. We are a global network of people's movements, parties, and organizations committed to the struggle against capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, and racism. And the goal of this course is to present some of the key historical facts and information that pertain to the current war in Ukraine. We believe that what we will be presenting is a critical history that is absolutely necessary in order to understand what is really happening in Europe today and how it concerns and affects the rest of the world. This course will have a total of 3 sessions, once a week for the next 3 weeks, starting today at the same day and time. And today's session, we're focusing on NATO, what it is, why and how it was founded, and what role it plays and has played in recent wars. For this, we are honored to have with us Vijay Prashad. Vijay is author of countless books, including a new book that is coming out in August, right, Vijay? Called The Withdrawal, which is co-written with Noam Chomsky. We will be looking out for that very soon. Vijay is also the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and editor of Leftward Books. And we also have joining us Laura Capote. Laura is a member of the Secretariat of Alba Movimientos, a network of people's movements from across the American continent. Laura is also part of Tricontinental Buenos Aires, and she is the host of Tricontinental Argentina's weekly current events show, Café Continental. And so with that, I think we will get started. Vijay will be the first to present. Followed by that, we will hear from Laura. And then we will take a short break. Throughout the entire presentations, people who are in Zoom can post your questions in the chat. We will be gathering them. We will take a short break after the presentations. And after that, we will do a couple rounds of Q&A with our two presenters. Thank you, Vijay. Please take it away.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks to the International People's Assembly for organizing this course on NATO versus Peace, a very well-named course. I'm going to get going directly because I have a lot of ground to cover with you. The first thing I want to say is that we should not be misled when we talk about NATO, means the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is in many ways a Trojan horse for the power of the United States. Let's first review a little bit about the military power of the United States. United States annually spends almost $1 trillion, $1 trillion on its military. If you add up not only the money spent on the military directly, the different branches of the military, but also the different intelligence services, including the National Security Agency, and the nuclear budget, which is in the Department of Energy budget. If you add it all together, that's $1 trillion. That's a lot of money. That's more than most countries, most major countries' military budgets combined. United States also has 800 military bases in over 80 countries. There's 193 member states of the UN. The US has military bases, 800 of them, in at least half the countries of the world. That's a lot of military bases. Most countries have 0 military bases outside their own territory. That's incredible. Keep that in mind. Every year, when the United States is not at war, it has about 200,000 military personnel, troops, outside the United States. 200,000 when it's not at war. This has not been a situation for a long time because the US has been at war quite consistently. But at a period when it's not at war, it has 200,000 people, military people overseas. The total US military personnel, if you add all the services plus the reserves, is 2 million people in arms. 2 million people in arms from the United States. United States weapons manufacturers exports weapons to most countries in the world and is the top weapons exporter to 96 of these countries. It's one of the most important exporters of weaponry in the world, therefore. And by the way, thanks to a study from Brown University, we learned that the Pentagon, just the US military, Navy, Air Force, and so on, emits more carbon than 171 countries put together. So it is the world's largest institutional polluter of carbon emissions. So the first thing to just recognize, I'm just putting it on the table, is the United States military is the most powerful force in the world. And I haven't even talked about its nuclear capacity, which is matched only by Russia. These are the only two countries which have comparable nuclear capacity. NATO is an instrument of US power. And we need to understand the capacity of the United States. Whatever declines are visible, there is no decline in its ability to destroy countries around the world. Might not be able to govern the world, but it can certainly destroy the world. That's the first point. Secondly, NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is not something that stands by itself. It emerges after World War II as part of an attempt by the United States to manage the world in its interest. And different parts of the world were divided up and organized through different treaty organizations. So the first treaty organization was the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. The Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. It's also called the Rio Pact because it was signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1947. That established a military alliance with countries in Latin America. Then in 1949, 2 years later, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was set up. If the Rio Pact was to organize pro-US Latin American countries into a particular military alignment, NATO was to organize Western European countries into a military alignment. But this was not again the only one. In 1954, in Manila, Philippines, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization was founded, and the next year in Baghdad, Iraq, the Central Treaty Organization was founded. This is what is known as the hub and spoke system of US power. Just like the wheel of a bicycle, the United States is the hub. The spokes are its friendly countries. Colombia, for instance, in South America, or at the time Iraq in the Middle East, now Israel and Egypt perhaps. In Europe, most of Western Europe, friendly countries, which allow US power in the hub to extend its reach to the perimeters of the world. So that it's in these countries that those 800 military bases are mainly secured. I've laid out for you 4 different treaty organizations. They cover the Americas, they cover parts of Asia, they cover all of Europe, and they cover most of the Middle East. These were considered by the United States at the time, in the 1940s and 50s, as the core regions for US power. It's where the minerals were, it's where the energy was, and it's where most of the food that they consumed was produced. Now, so that's the treaty organizations that were organized with so-called friendly countries. NATO is just one of them. It's not unusual. It's the only one that actually continues to exist in that form. I'll come back to that in a minute. United States also organized its military into various so-called commands, so that in 1947, it created the Far East Command, later called the Pacific Command, now called the Indo-Pacific Command. That was to organize all the US forces operating in the Pacific. Secondly, in 1952, the United States military organized the European Command, which basically works inside NATO headquarters, and it still exists. So the United States has their own military command inside Europe, which operates inside and alongside NATO command, and essentially is NATO command, because the rest of NATO is marginal compared to the US military's European command. There's also the Caribbean Command, 1963, the Southern Command in 63 as well. Caribbean and Southern Command was to organize US forces in the Caribbean and Latin America. Later, the Central Command was created in the Middle East, and as recently as 2007, the African Command was created. So what I want to first put out to you is the idea that NATO is not unusual. It's part of the attempt by the United States government to extend its power beyond its borders, using so-called friendly countries to both position its own forces and to coordinate with their military's US agenda overseas. Between 1949 and 1990, during the so-called Cold War, NATO basically operated in Europe and also operated to prevent Europe from building its own independent foreign policy. Several times between 1949 and 1990, France in particular, under Charles de Gaulle, attempted an independent foreign policy agenda. Through NATO, through the treaty that NATO established, the United States was able to prevent European independence. There are two important plans drawn up by Europeans called the Fouchet Plans, 1961 and 62. These were basically scuttled. They were destroyed by the pressure that comes from NATO. So during this period from 1949 to 1990, NATO's principal purpose was not only to so-called defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union, but it was really to subordinate Europe to US power. That was the real agenda that NATO was able to facilitate, to prevent Europe from creating its own foreign policy. When the USSR collapsed between 1990 and 91, three things came on the agenda for NATO that I would like to emphasize. The first, right after the collapse of the USSR, there was an accelerated process to integrate European countries. In 1993, European powers signed the Maastricht Treaty, and in 1997, they signed the Amsterdam Treaty. This attempted to create institutions that united European countries to have a better common market. The common market idea was there from earlier, but to have a better common market, to open borders and so on, but also to start developing a common foreign and strategic policy. NATO, in fact, the European Union, in fact, had a new effective foreign minister for Europe. That was taking place in the 1990s. That deeper integration of Europe, and then the common foreign and security policy called CFSP was being developed even more. in this period. It's very interesting. The reason why the United States drove NATO into the war against Yugoslavia in 1999, when you look at the evidence of this, part of the reason, not the entirety, but part of the reason was that Yugoslavian war was prosecuted to basically discipline European countries, particularly Germany. Germany was not permitted in this period to drive its own foreign policy in the Balkan countries, whether it's in the new Croatia or it's the newly created Czech Republic and Slovenia and so on. There was a way in which Germany's attempt to become the leading power in the Balkans and in sections of Eastern Europe was actually compromised by the United States insisting through NATO that Europe subordinate itself to US policy. So the first aspect of the post 1991 era was NATO was used again, because that had been the purpose earlier, again to make sure Europe was united, not together for its own agenda, but for a US agenda. The second purpose of NATO that became clear after 1990-91 was that in the charter, in NATO's charter from 1949, there's an article there called Article 5. What Article 5 says is if any NATO country is attacked, then all NATO countries are obliged to provide security, to help that country and so on. After the Al-Qaeda attack on the United States in 2001, Article 5 was exercised. And actually it's very interesting because the United States, after the attack of 9/11 by Al-Qaeda, the United States developed a view of war where they said, we will fight a war. This is George Bush's famous speech. We will fight a war anywhere and anytime. In other words, the US government effectively took the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which said that the US sphere of influence was the Americas, and said that now there's a global Monroe Doctrine. The US government can fight a war anywhere on the planet and anytime. Anywhere and anytime that suits the whim of the US president. And because they exercised Article 5, NATO got involved in the war in Afghanistan. And in subsequent global war on terror operations, NATO countries have been involved up to the neck. So the second aspect of NATO, what we began to see after the fall of the Soviet Union, was NATO began to articulate alongside the United States a global presence. It no longer was related only to Europe. It became global in many ways. And we begin to see this because in 2007, in the Lisbon Treaty, remember I mentioned that Europe created a foreign minister position, High Commissioner of, of basically foreign relations. In the second decade of the 21st century, NATO countries, as the EU, became involved in the negotiations with Iran around the nuclear question. Why were the Europeans involved in that anyway? What did they have to do with that? Through the EU and actually using the offices of NATO, European countries began to operate alongside the United States in its war on terror. That means now Europe had also begun to see itself as able to operate anywhere and at any time. This is going to become very important later with China. The third aspect that we begin to see is from 2006 onward, NATO leaders begin to talk openly about what they call global NATO. They begin to talk openly. They begin to say quite openly that they are now going to fashion something called global NATO, a global strategy for NATO. In 2021, NATO released a document called NATO 2030, which is peppered with the phrase global NATO. It's all over the place. Now, we know that the United States has many instruments to exercise power, and there are some contradictions in these. In the Cold War on China, which I'm going to get to in a minute, United States has developed an instrument in the Pacific called the Indo-Pacific Command. That's its own military. And then it has a new instrument called the Quad, Quadrilateral Security Arrangement, with Australia, Japan, and India. These are the 4 countries in the Quad. So these are all external to NATO. In fact, the Quad is sometimes called the Asian NATO. It's interesting use of the term, the Asian NATO. But NATO is not absent from this. You see, NATO enters Asia in 2 different ways. One is it enters through the so-called Five Eyes intelligence network. This is very interesting. These are the old white settler colonial countries with inheritances from Britain. The Five Eyes obviously are 5 countries: Britain, Canada, United States, New Zealand, and Australia. The 5 white settler colonial countries that come out of Britain are part of the Five Eyes intelligence network. These play a very key role in the pressure campaign on China, New Zealand and Australia being so-called frontline states in this. Secondly, the United States pushed France aside in creating a new security apparatus called AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, United States. Now, I have argued that AUKUS is more an arms deal than it is a security measure. But the French were very upset that their submarine sales to Australia had been set aside, and then the United States and Britain were going to sell nuclear submarines to Australia. But don't be misled by that fight. There are internal contradictions. The point I want to make is United States has other instruments in its pressure campaign on China. It has its own Indo-Pacific Command. It has the Quad. It has the Five Eyes, which includes 3 NATO countries, UK, Canada, and the United States. And it has the AUKUS development, which includes 2 NATO countries, United States and the United Kingdom. But still, NATO is getting involved there. NATO is conducting as like a friendly observer, participating in the so-called freedom of navigation missions that run through the sea lanes between Taiwan and China. We can discuss these freedom of navigation if we want later, but that's not relevant now. Point is that NATO has inserted itself into conflicts far afield. Okay, so that's the broad understanding of NATO as far as I'm concerned. Now, quickly, the last 10-15 minutes I want to come directly to the question of Ukraine. But I hope this has been pretty clear. NATO, founded in 1949, was hardly a unique instrument. It was just another instrument for the exercise of US power far from its territory, building unities with its allies, using those alliances to base its troops further than its own territory, build military bases and so on, extend its power all across the planet. So by the time you get to the 1960s and 70s, the United States could exercise power anywhere on the planet. This is something that, for instance, the Soviet Union could never do. Soviet Union never had the kind of basing structure and this hub and spoke system that the US had. After the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO has been utilized, number one, to deepen Europe's subordination to the United States. It's a very important piece. Secondly, it's been used through Article 5 to get NATO to operate on the US behalf outside Europe. So, for instance, Afghanistan was the first example, but then Libya was the second in 2011. And the third element of what's happened to NATO is NATO has now itself started to think about this concept, global NATO. Okay, so that's the post 1991 NATO has gone through these 3 things: subordination of Europe, operating alongside the United States because of Article 5, and then NATO developing its own idea of global NATO. Now, coming to Ukraine, this is the second part of my presentation. You see, there's a lot of talk about the idea of NATO moving eastward towards the Russian border. That in 1989-90, there was a handshake agreement made between Mikhail Gorbachev's foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, and the West German Bundesrepublik's Chancellor and James Baker of the United States. They had a handshake agreement saying we'll allow Germany to unify, but NATO must not move eastward of the German frontier, the East German border. Well, actually, this is not true. Russia did not complain after 1991. Boris Yeltsin, who was the head of the Commonwealth of Independent States and then Russia from 1991 to 1999, and then Vladimir Putin, who followed him, first he was Yeltsin's prime minister, and then he was the president from 1999 onwards, and then president, prime minister with Medvedev till today. In the first half of Putin's presidency and during the entirety of Yeltsin's presidency, the Russians had no problem with NATO moving eastward from the German border. After all, in 2004, 7 countries in Eastern Europe, including the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, joined NATO in 2004. At the time, Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister of Russia, welcomed the move of these countries joining NATO. Because remember, Russia was a partner of NATO from 1994 till 2014. So as long as Russia saw itself as wanting to integrate to the European project, Russia did not actually oppose the move eastward of NATO. There was no problem. In fact, Russia was then a part of the group of 7 countries, which had become the group of 8. So as long as Russia was willing to subordinate itself to the European project and therefore subordinate itself to the United States, everything was fine. After the world financial crisis, in Russia, Putin's government began to reassess the project of linking to Europe and therefore to the United States. At the same time, China began to develop its own agenda. In 2013, the Chinese announced the Belt and Road Initiative. 17 countries in Europe, including crucially Italy, which is a G7 member, signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time, it became very clear that because of NATO's war in Libya and the US-European imposition of sanctions on Iran, Europe was getting more and more reliant on energy sales from Russia, particularly natural gas. So Europe, it became clear by 2013, was becoming more and more integrated to Eurasia, Russia and China, than it was subordinate to the United States. This is the key reason why the conflict in Ukraine in 2014 heats up so much. You see, there was a conflict in Georgia, in South Ossetia in 2008. And by the way, when Russia twice, once under Yeltsin, second under Putin, savagely attacked the Chechenian people and leveled the city of Grozny, the West cheered it on. Even Thomas Friedman, he'll be well known to some people here, columnist for the New York Times, wrote a column in the New York Times in 2001 whose headline was "Rootin' for Putin," rootin' for Putin. In other words, cheering for Putin. That's Thomas Friedman. As long as this Russian project was subordinated to the United States, it was okay. But the moment Europe began to look to Asia, particularly Russian energy and Chinese investment, things went sour. You can't understand the conflict in Ukraine unless you see this as well. Now, I'm not getting into the details of the conflict in Ukraine because there's simply no time for that. But I want to emphasize that the question of NATO's eastward expansion is on the table. But it's not just about NATO's eastward expansion. It's about the threat levels that increased during the Trump administration. You see, Trump withdrew in 2017 from the Intermediate Nuclear Treaty. This is for intermediate range nuclear missiles. The United States unilaterally withdrew from that. Russians also withdrew. This is an extremely important indication to Russia that the United States was keen to use countries like Ukraine to put intermediate range missiles. Putin had given many speeches after that saying that Russia will not tolerate any missiles in Ukraine, will not tolerate. Now, there are all kinds of other explanations about, the oppression of the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, the question of the Azov battalion, the Nazis and all that. I'm not getting into all of that. I'm talking about the question of how NATO is involved here. The question of NATO expansion becomes a prestige issue. You see, France and Germany had made it clear, saying that they were not going to allow Ukraine to join NATO. They had made this clear beforehand. It was already indicated. The question wasn't even Ukraine joining NATO. The question was Russia felt threatened, that its security was under threat. Now, you can say this is a ridiculous thing. Russia is a major nuclear power. What is it worried about? What is it worried about? But nonetheless, this is what they articulated directly to the United States. They told them directly, we need security guarantees. The question should come up, why did the United States why were they unwilling to give security guarantees? There's a very important moment. Trump goes to Brussels, sits across the table from Jens Stoltenberg, and he says something to Jens Stoltenberg, which the Secretary General of NATO, which is very important. Trump reveals something that nobody talks about. He had that vulgarity. He sometimes said things that nobody is supposed to say in public. The cameras were rolling and Trump says to Stoltenberg, he says to him two things. One, why aren't Germans spending more on their defense? Why do they rely on the United States? And then he said, Germany is buying energy from Russia. You are delivering billions of dollars to the Russians. How is it that you want us to protect you from the Russians when you are energy dependent on them? Crucial point laid out there by Trump. He said what I've been trying to argue. How dare you not be subordinate to the United States? How dare you not be subordinate to the United States? You can't expect us to give you security if you're going to make money, if you're going to let the Russians make money off you. If anything, you should be paying the United States for your security. Remember, he was on this project of getting the Europeans to spend more money on their defense spending, not to rely on the United States. So the key aspect here is Europe. And I want to end with this. I would hope that there's a debate somehow, but I doubt it. I hope that a debate breaks out in Europe about its own self-respect. I mean, Europe has allowed itself through NATO to destroy the three main sources of its energy in Libya, in Iran, and in Russia. Energy prices are going to skyrocket, have already started to skyrocket in Europe. The cost of European subordination to the US project has been that working class people in Europe are going to suffer from high energy prices, high food prices. A discussion needs to take place primarily in Europe. Putting up Ukrainian flags on social media in Europe is not going to help you with your energy bills. Even if tomorrow you create a no-fly zone in Ukraine and dial up the ante of danger, that's not going to help your energy bills. It's about time Europe grow up and develop its own foreign policy and not hide behind the United States. United States, which is actually destroying your own economies, making you struggle. And here's the end. What does the United States offer as an alternative to Russian gas coming through Nord Stream 2 pipeline? What does the US offer? It offers natural gas liquefied, which is now 10 times more expensive than piped natural gas, liquefied from Qatar and the United Arab Emirates to be put on ships to travel to Hamburg and other ports, which have to be totally reconstructed. New platforms have to be created to deal with liquefied natural gas and to deliquefy it and so on. While the United States was saying all this in Europe, telling Europeans, don't worry, we'll get you a new source of energy, while the US was saying all this, the ruler of the United Arab Emirates was holding a meeting with ... Who was he meeting with? He was meeting with Bashar al-Assad of Syria. So much for the United States being able to define world affairs. It's not clear that the UAE is willing to sell cut price natural gas to Europe. They are cutting deals with Russia in the meantime. So, what is NATO? NATO is an instrument for the use of US power, now no longer just in Europe, but using NATO as an instrument around the world. NATO is a great destabilizing force in world affairs. Yes, by all means, criticize the Russians if you'd like for crossing the frontier into Ukraine and starting a war which, like all wars, is brutal and bloody. Of course, but this is not just a war about Russia and Ukraine. This is also a war about the great destabilizing forces in world affairs today, which is NATO as an instrument of the United States and principally US imperialism. Yes, prices are going to go up for everybody around the world, but also in Europe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay, for that excellent first presentation. And now we're going to move on to hear from Laura Capote from Alba Movimientos. Laura is going to be speaking in Spanish. So anybody who is not in the interpretation channel at this point and needs to, please go ahead and click on that globe icon and move into the interpretation channel.
Hola, gracias, Stephanie.
Hello, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everybody. They asked me insistently to speak slowly, so I will try to speak as slowly as I can to share with you something that we have talked about in Alba movements that for us explain somehow which is the role that the NATO has played with the intervention of the United States in our continent, another continent, which is the role of Latin America and the Caribbean. What role do they play in this world power of the United States, and how this policy is imposed with fire and blood by the imperialist forces, and particularly through the NATO. And this is an expression of the military possibility of the United States to be present in different places in the world, around the world, and having military bases as no other country has all over the world. And somehow how this impacted Latin America, and particularly, as mentioned, in the case of Colombia, which unfortunately is the country or one of the countries with which the United States maintained very close relationships, and they have signed an agreement as a favorite partner of NATO, that is Colombia. So we have two levels of interventions of NATO in Latin America, because the presence of the United States has been articulated in this system. As we said in the beginning, as mentioned, the role played by NATO in Latin America is not only geostrategic and political, but also economical and trying to extract cheap natural resources, that is drinking water, oil, minerals, and the United States with open hands is trying to get hold of our resources as the imperialism does. In this framework, today, the United States has 70 military bases in the Caribbean and in America. We published a book named The New Condor Plan, and here we have a map where you can see the presence.
Here you can see the military presence of the US, not only their military presence, but also the presence of the different cooperation agencies, the presence of hegemonic media, mass media, and how this strategy is located in our entire region. Here you can see particularly the region of the Caribbean, how it's full of economic, media, and military intervention. This is just a small illustration. We will share with you the links and methods to access this information. So here we can see the presence of the US in our region, and the new Plan Condor, as we call it, has been revamped and re-updated, actualized. A few more elements so that we can go into the Colombian case in particular. As BJ was saying, in this development of the military policy of the US towards foreign nations and the implementation of the commands, in our case, Latin America and the Caribbean deals with the Southern Command and how different policies have guided strengthening of military policy and presence both in the continent as well as in the seas, in the Caribbean and North-South American, specifically when we talk about the Colombian case. The chief of the Southern Command mentioned and announced this strengthening for two reasons. On the one hand, drug trafficking and terrorism, and on the other hand, the Chinese influence approach in Latin America. With these two justifications or motives, they justify their policies in the so famously called backyard. In the case of from Latin America and the Caribbean, of course, we strongly reject this Monroe Doctrine indebted vision. Of course, we talk about our America. In this context, it's also important to remember the large number of exercises and different missions that the Southern Command has carried out in Latin America and South America. From 2018 onwards, the Fourth Fleet and military exercise, particularly in countries that share a border with Venezuela. We know this is not a minor fact. When it comes to geopolitics, for the US, Venezuela is a concern. And two of the main allies, politically and military today, are Brazil and Colombia, who also share important land, important borders with Venezuela. In those territories where there are still colonial relations, where we still have countries in our region that are colonies of UK, of France and Holland, they also work as military bases and as other locations to carry out security and military exercises and strategies. We also think it's very important to remember the anniversary this year of the 40-year occupation of Malvinas, also called Falklands. They are Argentinian. They remain occupied by the United Kingdom, and they meant a very painful war for Argentina. The country continues struggling for memory, justice, and truth, and the reintegration of the territory to Argentina. So part of the imperialistic policy of the US was to, as I mentioned at first, to reach Colombia. As I said at first, just like Latin America and Caribbean is a strategic location for the US policy, specifically and especially in the case of Colombia, then there has been a relationship since at least the 19th century, a series of different approaches and organizations, military and economic policies among these two countries. I don't know if all of you know where Colombia is located. many people think it's in Central America. It's not. It's in South America, and it's precisely right there at the junction between Central America. We have a coast in both oceans. We are neighbors to Venezuela. We have Amazonian territory, and due to its geographical location, but also geopolitical location, there is a role here for us to play as the ideal place for the US to develop its policy of military control to guard the interests of the US. At least that's the way the political and military relationship was built between Colombia and the US. Starting from the 19th century, we were one of the countries where the Monroe Doctrine later on was most heavily implemented. It was, of course, also included in the treaty that Vijay mentioned. It was the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean that sent troops to the Korean War in support of the US. And the US, as a product of the social and the war in Colombia, the US has acted as a consultant against insurgencies and against different uprisings, politically armed uprisings. Particularly in 1962, if you remember the plan, it generated, in the end, the very famous republic that, for those of you who know about Latin American history, this was the beginning of the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. So the entire military strategy in Colombia has been aimed at supporting, quote unquote, the war against guerrilla organizations. And we're talking here about anti-communist war, which is always the very easy way to justify these things. Just like we have the struggle against drug trafficking, the war against terrorism, and now it's the war against everything. So in this context, the relationship with Colombia was strengthened, and we see here the most evident moment of this relationship in 1999, at the end of the 20th century, the sign of a treaty. We begin then this century, the signature of a treaty written in English. Our president at the time didn't even know English. He didn't know what he was signing. This was a treaty prepared by the US. It was signed and ratified by Colombia. And what did this mean? On the one hand, of course, re-engineering and an income of funds for the strategy and the war in Colombia. I mentioned this before. In the case of Colombia, we have been for over 60 years in a social, political, armed conflict, which has been supported, financed by the armed forces in Colombia. The armed forces in Colombia have been permanently trained by the US military forces. That's why we always say that it is a continental issue, not a national issue. We have here the expression in one single country of difficulties that are at a global scale. So with the military presence of the US, we see here the development of Colombia Plan. First of all, the emergence of the war itself, a war among brothers and sisters and siblings that has grown more and more to violate human rights, but it has also turned into a training ground for mercenaries that end up, as we saw last year in Haiti, with the assassination of leaders. They also buy second category weapons, used weapons, and end up being part of the ground that is fertile for the growth of paramilitary forces, which this, well, deserves a course all its own, but it has a lot to do with how the US acts in the regions where natural resources are strategic and available for their taking. And of course, the acceptance on behalf of Colombia, so who signs here is Andrés Pastrán, but it is Álvaro Uribe, in the end, who as president implements this treaty. They allow then military bases from Colombia to be used by the US. That's why we say that effectively there are more than 100 military bases to the US in Colombian territory. Now, what does this mean? Of course, a high level of military training and technology. Now, of course, when we say this, it may seem like we're obsessed with the quality of weapons or with military technology, but what this means is a high level of interaction in the context of also the Colombian War. So the Colombian state has financing available. They continue bombarding hundreds of encampments of guerrilla fighters, men and women. There's a high level of sophistication here in the war. I don't know if you remember, in 2008, there was a bombarding where Raúl Reyes was assassinated in the border with Ecuador. This developed a very big conflict. At the time, Commander Chavez was expressed his defense of the Ecuadorian sovereignty. And then something that is not often mentioned, and I think it's important to say, is that the dynamic of the war and the military presence of the US in Colombia and immunity of the military officials of the US in our country mean that when they commit any kind of crime in our territory, they cannot be judged, they cannot be tried by the national mechanisms, but these cases can also not be taken to the international courts. This becomes a very concerning point, particularly because the region where these military bases are located, we've seen great amount of sexual abuse and human trafficking. We're talking here about children not older than 12 or 13 years old. North American militaries kidnap a lot of children, mainly in the poorest regions of the country. They abuse them sexually, and when the mothers of these children want to denounce this, the answer is always that they have diplomatic immunity and nothing can be made. So it's not just about the dynamics of the war in general terms or bombs and airplanes, but we're talking about what this means very specifically on the bodies of children, of little girls and women who are there in the poorest regions of our continent. It is also the case in Haiti, not only in the more strict military context, but also in the very disguised forms of imperialism that we see also very present in our region. What has this meant in numbers? So the war financed by the US is a structure operated to ensure the strategic use of NATO, to have the hemisphere under control. Now, according to the latest declarations, the threat is China and also general security threats. So we see here in Colombia peasant farmers, men and women farmers have been dislocated, have been expelled from their own region. So a lot is said about people leaving their countries, but very little is said about people having to leave their territories within the borders. We're talking about 9 million hectares. We have 150,000 people disappeared with no process, no ongoing process, and complete impunity. There is no investigation here in terms of what has happened with this 150,000 people. And we're talking about a few years, from the year 2000 up until now. And finally, to close, I wanted to mention two things. First, what's happening right now when it comes to the relationship between Colombia and NATO. There is a path of negotiation and approach. As I mentioned, this has been historical, permanent between the US and Colombia. And in this context, what we have seen in this relation is the attempt to have Colombia participate outside of NATO, defending NATO interests, but without being part of the club itself, not being one of the member nations of NATO. In 2013, these dialogues began, and in 2018, Colombia became a global associate of NATO. This is important, and it's a unilateral U.S. decision that allows the U.S. Congress, through the Act of 1989, this is not an invitation of NATO to Colombia. It's an invitation of the Congress, of the U.S. Congress to Colombia. In that context, even though, again, the dialogue had begun, it hadn't been confirmed, but what we still saw was different military approaches. It may seem for us impossible to increase and for the funding to grow even more, the funding to Colombian war, but it still grows. And what we see here is permanent military training of Colombian military in different schools, in the schools of the America and other schools of military training in Europe, associated with NATO, Germany, and the United Kingdom.
Permanente flujo de intercambio de información de inteligencia y de ciberseguridad entre Colombia.
There was formation of intelligence and security. It was a treaty between the United States and Colombia, and of course, a qualification of operational systems of the Air Force, drones, and other war materials. It's a process of qualification of the armed forces, Colombian armed forces, to be accepted as a favorite partner in NATO. In Colombia, the annual budget was 4%. The military budget in Colombia was 4% of the GDP. That's it to say, a very important part of the national budget, which is invested in the armed forces and security forces. They created the plan Paz Colombia against the plan Colombia Crece or Colombia Grows, and euphemisms in order to strengthen the armed forces. In the over the last few years, we had the presence of assistance brigades, American brigades in Colombian territory, in meetings near the, coincidentally, the frontier with Venezuela. Also where there are strategic natural resources which are found in the whole region of Colombia close to the Venezuelan frontier, which is an excuse to station military forces there. Finally, what is going to happen now? There will be a meeting in Washington with the President of the United States and the President of Colombia, and this treaty will be ratified so that Colombia becomes a global partner of the NATO. Not a full member, but and then it's a military forces of second range as an extended hand of the United States in Latin America. There is a agreement to buy weapons from the United States after the technological assistance and the military education by the US to training the Colombian armed forces. And there will be legislation regarding intelligence and security with the support of NATO. So the government will have not only their qualification in NATO, but something more technological, which is a consequence of its close relationships with the NATO. This is what I want to say. We are all leftist activists, but I wanted to express these elements which are product of our studies and reflections. We have done quite an effort regarding this map. I will pass this map over to you all, which has important information regarding the President of the United States in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was an excellent presentation, and that is exactly what we need. We need more analysis from movement activists like you, who are at the front lines leading struggles. So excellent. Thank you so much. Folks, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to play a video from the MST about a recent activity, a recent event that took place. We want you to continue to put your questions in the chat if you're in Zoom. We already have a few questions that we're going to come back to after the short break. We're going to ask a couple round of questions. So yeah, let's take a quick break.
As crianças não precisam aprender a atirar. As crianças precisam aprender a estudar, como aprendem aqui nas escolas do movimento sem terra e nos assentamentos. Eu tenho certeza que no dia 2 de outubro o povo vai dar um golpe no fascismo. O povo vai dar um golpe, nesses milicianos, e a gente vai restabelecer a democracia e o prazer pela vida nesse país. A gente vai voltar a falar de amor, a gente vai voltar a falar de solidariedade, a gente vai voltar a falar de fraternidade, a gente vai fazer distribuição de livros e vamos acabar com essa venda de arma que só interessa a fascista nesse país.
Brincar, sorrir, lutar, para a bandeira popular. Brincar, sorrir, lutar, por reforma agrária popular.
Há 13 anos atrás, lá em 2009, quando o Lula, né, caneteou lá o papel e disse, ó, essa área vai ser destinada à reforma agrária. E a partir de lá nós assumimos um compromisso, né, as famílias se organizando, né, em toda essa questão da saúde, da produção, da educação. Nossa, é uma emoção muito grande mesmo tê-lo aqui e mostrar para ele que é possível, né, a reforma agrária é possível.
É um dos países com maior concentração de terra, então a reforma agrária é fundamental para que a gente possa, né, imaginar um futuro onde todos tenham acesso à comida saudável. Então esse evento e esse lugar, o assentamento, ele vive um exemplo, né, de que pode dar certo, de que a agricultura familiar realmente coloca a comida na nossa mesa de uma maneira limpa, de uma maneira gostosa, de uma maneira saudável.
Essas pessoas aqui fizeram a diferença. E a gente aprende com o MST que quão mais próximo da terra, quão mais humilde, quão mais conhecedor dessas dificuldades que a gente tem no Brasil, mais solidárias as pessoas se tornam.
Eu não quero tirar o lugar de ninguém. A única coisa que eu quero é dar oportunidade igual. A filha de uma empregada doméstica tem o direito de ter a mesma oportunidade que a filha da sua patroa. E aí eu quero ver essa disputa quem é melhor. Então eu tenho dito o seguinte, a solução nossa vai ser assim. Primeiro, a gente vai ter que colocar o pobre no orçamento. E a gente vai, em contrapartida, a gente vai colocar o rico no imposto de renda. ele vai ter que pagar de acordo com o que ganha. Nós precisamos recuperar a soberania brasileira. Um país soberano cuida do seu povo. Um país soberano cuida da educação. Um país soberano cuida da saúde. Um país soberano, o governo decide tomar conta da sua fronteira, das suas riquezas minerais, das suas florestas, das suas águas, dos seus alimentos. Um governo soberano é aquele que cuida do seu povo em primeiro lugar e depois fica quieto ou vai tentar ajudar os outros que precisam mais do que ele.
Terra, trabalho, direito de existir. Mulheres em luta não vão sucumbir.
Pode chegar.
Okay, and we are back. So we have a lot of questions that we have accumulated via the chat on Zoom. We're going to try to get to as many questions as possible because this is an activity that is being broadcast to people from all around the world and in a lot of different languages. This is always a little bit challenging because people are posting the questions in their language. So the best that we can do is we select a few questions that we think can speak to the presentations and that can complement what has been shared. We will read those in English and then people will hear them via the interpretation channel in their language. We try to raise as many questions as possible. If you have a question, Mohammed, please put it in the chat. We are not going to open up the microphone at this time in this seminar, so please put your question in the chat in the language that you would like to. So I'm going to start with 3 questions and we'll do as many rounds of questions as possible. I'm going to start with a question that I think it can be answered by either Laura or Vijay. So the question is, we know that war is an imperialist tool to perpetuate the control by imperial powers over resources and people. We also know that NATO exists for this purpose, but isn't it true that specific governments and countries in Europe, or in the case of Colombia and Latin America, are complicit in this imperialist strategy, even though it is to the detriment of their own people? Why is it that European governments, or I would add the Colombian government, are complicit in a strategy that doesn't benefit their own interests? So that's the first question. I think maybe Laura, you can give some comments, but Vijay also may be speaking to the specific of Europe. Why is Europe participating in this way? The second question is, many feel that this conflict differs from others because it involves a country in possession of nuclear weapons. Can the NATO alliance against Russia be considered the nucleus of an outbreak of World War III? What is the real risk of the use of nuclear weapons? I think, Vijay, maybe you can speak to that. And I think a third question that references the history of NATO is, also I think maybe for Vijay, how much would you say that the wars in Yugoslavia and Ukraine are motivated by the same agenda? Will the Ukraine be split into different parts, do you think? So maybe we can start with you, Laura, maybe giving some comments on this first question, but also feel free to comment on the other questions if you'd like to.
Gracias, Stephanie. Sí, sobre lo primero, un poco lo que les comentaba antes, que para nosotros y nosotras es clave en ese sentido, es cómo se...
Well, firstly, it is key for us how the same states in Latin America, Latina, they develop their internal policies, looking at the mirror of looking themselves at the mirror of the United States. In the case of Colombia, this includes armed guerrilla forces for up to 60 years have been there, and that the Colombian state had to strengthen their counterinsurgents supported by the United States. So it's convenient for the United States, this alliance with Colombia, of course. Is it convenient for Colombia? It depends what Colombia we're talking about. The ruling classes that rule the state, for them, this is convenient. But for the project, this is convenience, so that they have an association with the United States that will finance and train this counterinsurgents strategy upon which the Colombian state has been founded. Since last century, they have developed a strategy considering that the alternative political forces were enemies which will have to be rivaled in democratic processes through elections and through democratic debates, but they would be alternative expressions of policies that should have been murdered, eliminated. And this includes a strong military relationship with the United States to develop the war against the guerrillas, and with an anti-communist ideology. And these are related, these guerrillas are related to the communist ideology, and inspired, some of them, by the Cuban Revolution. So the Colombian state needs funds from the United States, military funds and weapons to fight the enemy, which was occupying parts of the national territory. By the end of the 20th century, those were years where the Colombian guerrilla and the FARC, the FARC, occupied territory, and they were getting closer to Bogota, the capital city. So these advances of the guerrilla and the armed struggle was being efficient, and they were growing politically and militarily. So there was a process where the so-called Plan Colombia and this alliance with the United States allows the Colombian state to have an army financed with technology and weapons from the United States. And on the other hand, guerrilla fighters that only had guns, and they had knowledge of the territory. So this domestic sort of war or civil war in Colombia had to be stopped by the ruling classes. So that's why they need this relationship to the United States, because they need it to resolve the social and military conflicts, which are, we could call them a civil war in Colombia. And they are deepening this alliance with the United States nowadays as becoming part of or an associate state to NATO.
Yeah, okay. So those are
Muy bien, entonces.
Sorry. Those are excellent questions. Let's recognize something about the contradictions of US and European business elites, firstly. You know, the United States investment in Europe is 3 times greater than US investment in Asia. And European Union investment in the United States is 8 times greater than European investment in India and China. So the integration between the US and European elites is very high economically. Now, as a consequence of this integration, and here's the fragility of the relationship, the United States tried with Europe to create a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. It was a big trade agreement, would have created one of the biggest trading blocs without barriers in the world. But that partnership agreement failed. And so here you have that contradiction. On the one side, these are extremely close trading partners, enormous investments in each other, but they couldn't agree on a barrierless trading system because some European countries don't like the kind of cowboy capitalism in the United States, including like GMOs of different kinds and all kinds of things. Anyway, so why does the European ruling class integrate itself and allow itself or actively become subordinate to US policy? There are enormous economic benefits. The problem is these economic benefits are getting less and less because there is more benefit to integrate with China and with Russia, at least for some sectors. And in my opinion, I feel that because the United States has very little else to put on the table, the question of force becomes the main principle. I mean, the US really pushed the crisis in Ukraine in 2014. Many European countries were uncomfortable with the acceleration of the crisis. At every moment when it looked like there could be an exit from the Ukraine crisis, United States accelerated even more. And so, you got to wonder, and obviously I'm speculating, you have to wonder why the US was so eager, why Vicky Nuland was so eager from the US State Department to accelerate the crisis in Ukraine, because they seem to be losing Europe. Look at Colombia, which Laura talked about. Looks like Gustavo Petro might win the presidency. Victoria Nuland arrives in Bogota, the same person who's in the Euromaidan in 2014. She starts talking about the problems in the election system in Colombia. Be careful, guys. Be careful. Gustavo Petro is going to lose the election because they may not want him to win, because they can't afford to allow Colombia to slip away. Be careful. Recently, the left has even more cemented its unity as Francia and Petro made an agreement. Don't know what's going to happen in Colombia. Be careful. When Vicky Nuland comes to town, you never know what's happening next, okay? Second, nuclear. Let's not minimize the threat. These are dangerous people. Let's remember that this is 2022. United States has already used nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Already used nuclear weapons. It's not a theoretical question. Would they use nuclear weapons again when the other side also has nuclear weapons? We're dealing with a bourgeoisie that's crazy. So I don't put it past anybody to take us to the brink. That is the reason why it is doubly important to strengthen people's movements and to prevent this from getting out of hand. These are dangerous people. Look at the way they destroyed Iraq. Look at the way they destroyed Iraq. Don't forget that, how they destroyed Libya. They destroyed Libya in 2011. It's still destroyed. Ruthless use of power. They destroyed Afghanistan over decades. So, can they use a nuclear weapon? Not putting it past them, but we must fight to prevent it. That is why I'm hoping this year on Hiroshima Day, people are going to be out there demonstrating. We need to be doing something to bang the drum against casual use of so-called battlefield nuclear weapons. The third question is about Yugoslavia and Ukraine. It looks similar, but the context is different. In 1999, when the United States and NATO went and bombed Yugoslavia, bombed Belgrade, quite devastating bombing, the first time Europe had seen that since World War II, Dresden and all that, carpet bombing of cities. Anyway, At that period, Russia was subordinate to the United States. Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia. China was a greatly weakened country at that period. You know, in fact, NATO warplanes, actually US planes, bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the 1999 bombing. They actually bombed the Chinese embassy. China just could complain about it, couldn't do anything. These were weakened countries in 1999. Now, China and Russia are much strengthened than they were. Russian politics, Russia does not have a socialist government or anything. It has a deeply patriotic government, different from Yeltsin. Putin has basically generated a kind of Russian patriotic government. His party is, after all, called United Russia. They are a very Russian nationalist government. The Chinese have developed an agenda, much strengthened since 1999, developed an agenda, economic agenda that's far outside China's borders now. And so when Biden calls Xi Jinping, as he did last Friday, in that phone call, Xi Jinping is not saying, whatever you say, great Lord from Washington, D.C., we will obey you. No, they say, this is how we see the world. So you better not do X, Y, Z. It's the same from Russia. You see, Putin is not Yeltsin 1999. So even though Ukraine may get destroyed in the process and may, in fact, is already broken up. What are we saying might break up? Already Crimea is with Russia. Already Lugansk and Donetsk are with Russia. It's likely other parts of Ukraine may break up. It's already breaking up. Yes, all that may happen. But the context between Yugoslavia 1999 and Ukraine 2022 is very different. We are at a different period where the United States is weakened, but it has not declined. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. The United States is a much weakened power, but it's definitely not declined. It's very wrong to underestimate the power of the United States.
Thank you, Vijay. We have 3 more questions that we would like to put forth. I think that either of you can answer them. Maybe both of you can give some comments. So here they are. So the first question goes, there's a lot of agreement about the crimes of NATO and the need to hold it responsible. But what is the responsibility of Russia in the invasion of Ukraine? And on what basis is there a general tendency towards its support? Isn't it just a capitalist country that defends its interests and expansion, just like the United States? That's the first question. Second question goes as follows. Trying to read slowly so that you guys have a time to write it down, and also so that we can have interpretation come along. Okay? Next question. We have seen how much the war in Ukraine dominates the media. Why do, for example, French media is an example, present what is happening in Ukraine while it turns a blind eye to all the uprisings and wars that are taking place in other parts of the world? I think this is a question that either of you can answer. And then the last question, how do we create an anti-war position on the Russia and Ukraine conflict, but still have an understanding and an elaborate resistance to the NATO agenda? I think that question kind of connects to the first question maybe, but I'm going to let you guys take it away. Maybe Laura first and then Vijay.
Ok, gracias, Stephanie. Sí, sobre...
Well, thank you, Stephanie. So on the second question, it had to do with the role of mass media and how they've been covering the development of the war, Russia and Ukraine. It's something that we always notice, the silence, the way the agenda is so selective and how they aren't mentioning other conflicts. And actually in the map that I share with you, one of the elements here is where we can see the large conglomerate of media in terms of giving visibility, but also a lack of visibility to conflicts in our continent. So if I ask to those of you, the ones who aren't from Latin America, no cheating. If I ask you, what's happening in Colombia, how long there's been a war, what's happening in Haiti, what's happening in the border between Mexico and the US, what are the conflicts in Paraguay, what's happening with the popular sectors of Argentina, what's happening with the poor sectors of Brazil, what are the products of the US intervention in the most detailed aspects of the reality of our people, probably you won't have much idea about this. And this actually takes me back to the video that opened the class today and has to do with the importance of alternative media and different types of media that can allow us to familiarize ourselves with those other conflicts and wars. Sometimes it's very terrible to think about wars only in terms of numbers, quantity, how many deaths, whether one person or 50,000 or 100 people die. But if for just one moment, the hegemonic media would show the incredibly large number of disappeared and deaths that US imperialism has left only in Latin America. Let's say in the last 22 years, just to mention the 21st century, I think the front pages of an entire year would not suffice to tell all of the stories, not only of the specific impact of the occupation, but also the coup d'etats and political destabilization that the presence of the US imperialism has had as a result. So it's about thinking, of course, to have an anti-war stance, to defend the peace of the people, and not to fall into this idea of peace for peace itself. We're talking about peace here with social justice, a politicized peace, not the peace of the burial ground, but to give visibility and to make sure that media also portrays and shows other voices and other realities, people that just because they aren't white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, have no possibility of being shown in the front pages. So those from the grassroots, Black people, social militants are the ones who suffer, and they are the ones who end up being invisibilized in the dynamic of mass media. So that's why it's always worth it to make this question: who is telling me the story and what are they telling me? So suspicion here is the tool. So the things that are silenced and those that aren't, the things that are sometimes given a bigger dimension in the agenda of mass media.
So Laura has actually entered the second question and closed it. This is the question about the international division of humanity. Some people's lives matter, others don't. I think, we all need to take this very seriously. It's the refugee policy of Europe is disgraceful. It's a disgrace. I mean, they have demonstrated once again that they are not a serious people. If this is exactly what the governments are going to propose to do, open the doors immediately to Ukrainians, but shut the Mediterranean to Libyans, Syrians, Afghans, all of NATO's wars, in fact, all of NATO's wars. Afghans and Libyans should be welcomed with open arms into, wherever, Germany and, etc. Anyway, the other two questions. Now, let's take the question of Russian expansion and so on. In fact, it's interesting. Russia is a major nuclear power, number 2 nuclear power in the world. Russia has about, several 100,000 members of its military under arms. Russia actually has the capacity, to come in and force conflicts in many parts of the world. And by the way, this idea that the war in Ukraine is going slowly and the Russians are being held and defeated and so on, people don't remember the Iraq war in 2003. I reported that war. You remember that when the bombing started of Baghdad, shock and awe, that went very well for the US. They pulverized the city. But when the US troops left Kuwait and started driving northward to Baghdad, a sandstorm hit them and they were stuck for days. They couldn't move north. And this is the context where the Iraqi army had basically disappeared and become the insurgency. And yet it took weeks for the US to subordinate Iraq, which they had pulverized already in 91 and had held in a crippling sanctions regime through the 90s. Still, it took a long time. Wars are not easy, okay? The United States was defeated by 38 million, not 38 million Afghans, but hundreds of thousands of Taliban defeated the United States in Afghanistan. It's hard to fight a war. I'm not saying you should have sympathy for the Russian army, okay? Just saying that the reporting saying they've been blocked. No, the issue is Russia could actually prosecute many wars. They could go into Kazakhstan, where 20% of the population in Kazakhstan are Russian speakers. In fact, a member of the Duma of Mr. Putin's party, United Russia, made a speech saying we need to go into Kazakhstan. You know, there are a lot of crazy people in the world. So Russia has the military capacity, but it doesn't seem to intervene everywhere. And that's a question. It's not a question of why did they intervene in Ukraine. The question should also be, why have they not intervened in other places? You know, after all, look at the United States. In living memory, it's intervened in so many conflicts. In Somalia, sells arms for the bombing of Yemen, intervened in the conflict, supporting Morocco in the annexation of Western Sahara, intervened in Libya, intervened in Iraq, intervened in Afghanistan, in many ways continues its war against Venezuela and against Cuba and so on. United States intervening in about 50 conflicts at a time. In that sense, the Russians fairly modest. Why? There's two reasons actually. Since the 2000s, when Mr. Putin became the president for the second time, in his second term, after the world financial crisis in 2007, Russia started to consolidate and rebuild the state a little bit. The state had been totally collapsed by privatization, by the takeover by a handful of elites and so on. Tried to recover the state. Russia was extraordinarily weakened in that period. Its military was not in good shape. In fact, it had a hard time producing arms for sale overseas. India switched to buying arms from Israel in this period and now has returned to buying arms from Russia because Russia has recovered some of that, its industrial production and so on. So in this period from Putin's second presidency onward, Russia began to rebuild the state. He began to insist. But at best, Russia is an exporter of energy and foodstuffs and so on. It's not a high-tech exporter. It's basically in the same situation in a way as Venezuela was before the sanctions really hit Venezuela hard. It was an energy exporter. Venezuela's principal export was oil. Russia's principal export is oil and natural gas. It's basically an exporter of raw materials, like many third world countries. By the 2000s, it's not a high-tech exporter, not like China, which moved to the high-tech area. So that's one thing. It's a pretty weak economy. It's a pretty weak economy, reliant on export of energy, very much reliant. If not to Europe, now it's exporting to China. Very much reliant. So the question of imperialism isn't there. It's not seeking out new markets or anything. The two major Russian interventions overseas, in Crimea in 2014, the taking of Crimea, and the military intervention in September 2015 in Syria, are defensive interventions. Because Russia intervened in both of these countries to defend its ports. It had warm water ports in Sebastopol, Crimea, and it had warm water ports in Tartus, Syria. That's the principal reason for Russia's intervention. The annexation of Crimea 2014 and entry into defend the government of Bashar al-Assad in 2015. It's not really to extend its power, it was to protect its ports. I see these as defensive interventions. I don't see Russia as an imperialist country. By the way, it may appear to somebody who's sitting in Odessa today and getting bombed by Russian planes that it's imperialist. But that means that Saudi Arabia should be characterized as imperialist because Saudi planes are bombing Sana'a and other cities in Yemen. But Saudi Arabia is not an imperialist country. It's also a two-bit exporter of energy. It's a basic platform of US power. It doesn't have an independent economy. Its economy is totally dependent on other countries in the world. So these are not imperialist interventions. These are horrible interventions. The war on Yemen is horrible. Bombing from the standpoint of a civilian in Kiev or in Odessa or in Mariupol is appalling from that standpoint. But that doesn't make the bomber an imperialist. You can get attacked by a military, but the military is not imperialist. It's just a ghastly military that's bombing you. So that's the first thing. What's the anti-war position to be? In my opinion, it's pretty clear. You've got to have an immediate ceasefire. You've got to have an immediate ceasefire. I mean, right now, there have been two diplomatic initiatives. One in Antalya, Turkey, when Kudayev, the Ukrainian foreign minister, and Sergei Lavrov had a conversation. That didn't go far at all. It didn't think. But on the border between Belarus and Ukraine, an ongoing process is taking place. Now, things are on the table. Even Mr. Zelensky, who ridiculously asked for a no-fly zone and so on, they have accepted some of the Russian demands. No security guarantees. They've accepted the question of no NATO and so on. Some things have been accepted, but a ceasefire is very important. See, I'll tell you why the Russians are not going to do an immediate ceasefire. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the government of Petro Poroshenko of Ukraine cut off water to go to Crimea. Crimea is a place with, a population of people. No, it's not only a port, it's civilians as well. Crimea is linked to Russia by a bridge over the Black Sea. And Russia was forced to send tankers of water to bring drinking water to the Crimea. It's very clear to me, when you watch the battle that the Russians are waging, they are trying to build a land bridge to Crimea that's going to link Donetsk and Lugansk to the Crimea. And Mariupol is in the middle of that land bridge. Now, whether this is the permanent land bridge that they want to hold after negotiations, talking about breaking up Ukraine, or whether this is a issue of post-conflict negotiation, that we'll give up this territory, but we have to have water guarantees. If you cut the water off, we're going to come in again. I don't know for sure what the Russians will put on the table. But it looks to me like an anti-war position has to be return to diplomacy immediately, ceasefire. Look, all wars end in diplomacy. You might as well accelerate to diplomacy. Let's stop the war. So I don't think a position of the left should ever be continue to prosecute the war. Even those who believe that the Nazis should be destroyed and all that, this is not the way to do it, because you're killing civilians. And we know from every conflict, for every civilian you kill, you're going to create another opponent. Somebody will be radicalized. It's very dangerous to believe that this kind of war is good. Look, even World War II, the heroic fight to defeat Nazism, in the end didn't actually defeat it. The Nazis keep coming back, my friends. They keep coming back. You could hang Mussolini and humiliate Mussolini, but Italy will continue to have a problem of fascism. It has to defeat fascism culturally, politically, socially. It has to make fascism impossible. Just hanging Mussolini from a tree is not going to end it for you. Watching Hitler kill himself in a bunker doesn't end fascism. Right now, bombing these cities is not going to end fascism. It's going to continue to reappear, and it might even strengthen. Ukraine might become a hotbed of fascistic forces. So an anti-war position has to be ceasefire, diplomacy, security guarantees for Russia, dignity for the people of Ukraine, including the Roma people. There's a lot of talk about Russian speakers in Ukraine. You forget the Roma people in Western Ukraine who face great oppression. Moldovan speakers, Hungarian speakers, and so on. Ukraine needs to commit itself to being a plurinational state. Why not? Put that on the table.
Thank you, Vijay. So we're going to ask, we had a lot of questions, but we're really coming up on the limits of this session, which is ending in exactly 10 minutes. So we're going to ask one more question, and then I ask you guys to share your closing comments, please. So we have been reminded by Mohammed Hakesh that NATO has always been a warlike instrument of imperialism, and that NATO has massacred millions of innocent people in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. So the question here is, why is it so important right now for us to understand NATO following this process of war in Europe? And so this is our last question, and I ask you to please add any closing comments with your response to this question. Maybe Laura and then Vijay.
Ok, bien. No, yo creo que la pregunta justamente es, además de reconocer la importancia de conversar y de hacer un espacio como este para reflexionar sobre qué es la OTAN y lo que eso implica, es inclusive traerlo como un pequeño recordatorio de que las generaciones más jóvenes y los militantes y las militantes más jóvenes de las organizaciones que por ahí no tienen de alguna manera en la cabeza la dimensión, como tú dices en la pregunta, de los efectos sobre miles y millones de inocentes de las acciones militares.
The young militants maybe are not aware of the dimensions of the NATO all over the world. So we should remind that these processes of political education play a fundamental role, because when we talk about NATO, it's like maybe we're talking about last century, as if we were talking about the Second World War or the something very old for young militants. But to see that NATO is alive, that the military presence of the United States through NATO exists in the world, and particularly in the case of Latin America, it determines the life of millions of peoples in our continent. And it's fundamental to think on the most important, which is how we struggle against that. We have to get to know the enemy in order to be able to fight it. So we have to know what the strategies are through which the imperialism enters our continent and operates in our territories. But this also puts us in an internationalist, anti-imperialist field of action, but always standing on the side of defending the sovereignty of our countries and the rights of our peoples, particularly in our region. This is vital. And we should remind the gringos and the United States government that we are not their backyard, that Latin America is not the United States, it's a different continent, and there is a region which has generated different processes of sovereignty that we are willing to defend, such as the cases of Cuba and Venezuela, which they see as enemies. So we have to solve our material needs through knowledge. We have to know the enemy in order to struggle against it. And what I think it's interesting is to invite everybody to get to know these other expressions in which the NATO and the imperialistic strategy of the United States, how it has impacted our continent. Talking about Latin America has a lot to tell about that, but all these strategies of counteracting the influence of the imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean has to be put forward with a socialist flag and with process defending our sovereignty. We are willing to defend, as Commander Chavez said, our land. So this is very important. And of course, we want to invite you to visit the map, as I told you. Today, we don't have this map translated into other languages, but if somebody wants to translate it, you will be welcome. This is interesting also for other regions to revise and to discuss which are the present or nowadays mechanisms through which the American imperialism operates in our territories. And I think that any region in the world, we are popular and socialist militants, and we have to know how our enemy moves. So thank you.
Well,
Vijay?
So the first thing I want to say is that, we are sometimes our own enemies. And I would welcome you to come to the website of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, because we have a dossier this month on militarization in Brazil, which is about Brazil's great history of having the second largest military in the Americas after the United States. What does Brazil's military supposed to do? Well, mostly internal policing, as far as I understand. Come and read that dossier. It's powerful. This week, I write about the dossier in the newsletter, and the end of the newsletter has a poem by the great Brazilian poet Ferrier Goulart. I really like this poem. In 1975, he writes, "In the world, there are many traps. And what is a trap could be a refuge, a place to hide. What is a trap could be a refuge. And what is a refuge could be a trap." You see, NATO is now presenting itself as a refuge for the world's security. It's going to protect the security of people against tyrants. That's what NATO is putting itself forward as. It's NATO versus tyrants. But what we are saying is NATO is a warmonger, which is why the name of this class is not NATO versus tyrant. It's NATO versus peace. NATO is an enemy of peace globally. Used to just be a military pact for Europe. Increasingly, as both Laura and I have shown, it's become a military pact to destabilize the world. Whereas people are interested in dealing with questions of hunger, homelessness, illiteracy, all of these pressing problems for the billions of people around the planet, NATO and NATO-like people want to spend our social wealth on nuclear weapons, on long-range bombers, on intermediate missiles. We need to draw the line pretty firmly. We are on the side of ending hunger, not on the side of building another long-range bomber. We are on the side of more schools, less prisons. We got to draw the line fundamentally. And that's why I'm proud that this class is called NATO versus peace. We stand for peace. They stand for war. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay, and thank you, Laura. And thank you, everybody, for connecting today. I wanted to remind everyone that next week we are going to have the second session of our course. And our second session is going to be focused on sanctions. And we think that understanding sanctions is fundamental to understanding the conflict right now. There is a tendency in the media right now to downplay the violent nature of sanctions. And as we know, or some of us are aware, some of us very close to home, sanctions are not being applied only to Russia today. There are numerous countries that are under brutal sanctions by the United States today, many of them in Latin America, many of them in other parts of the world, such as in the Arab region, etc. So next session is going to be on Wednesday, the same time that you connected today, over the same platform, same links. And we will be focusing on sanctions. So we hope to see you here next week. Thank you, everybody. And thanks again, Vijay and Laura, for an excellent class. For anybody that would like to promote this class, it's going to remain recorded on the YouTube channel of the IPA in all of the different languages. So please go ahead, and if you enjoyed it, share it in all of the groups that you're in and promote it so that people can watch it later on their own time. Thank you, everybody.